Heavenly Father, we ask your blessing on this time of Bible study as we consider what your word says from Genesis chapter 25 and 26 and how it applies to our lives. God, we ask your blessing on this time in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so here's what I want to encourage you. Let me share this for the sake of the recording. Here we go. Here is our Bible study outline. You have the same thing right in front of you. And we're going to start right there at conflict sets the stage of the story of Isaac. And trying to get to it in my, there it is, right there. Conflict sets the stage for the story of Isaac. What's that? Yeah, page 2, the bottom, exactly, the bottom of page 2. Hey, good to see y'all. Good to see y'all. So if everyone should know who this is Brother Ed, Pastor Ed and Lynn, who have been singing in the choir. These are a couple of our newest additions, God adding people to the life of the church and increasing the mission of First Congregational Church. So that's where we'll be starting, right at the bottom of page 2. Well, right at the top of page 2 there, up towards the top, where it says conflict sets the stage for the story of Isaac. So up till now, just most recently, a little quick recap, we were talking last week about Abraham's great concern for his son Isaac finding a wife. We talked a little bit about Sarah's death and subsequent burial, and the question came up about where that was and why. And it turns out, as Bruce mentioned, who was zooming in from Aruba, that in fact he had been there. And as we read on in the passage, as you read on into chapter 25, you find that that's the same place, as Bruce had mentioned, having been to that site, that Abraham was eventually buried there with his wife also. And that happens in chapter 25, verses 1 through 18. And then this gives a whole list of all these other future children that Abraham had, that you could say he sired in a sense through concubines mostly, and through his second wife named Keturah. And this gives a bunch of genealogy through those things that help us historically to identify various branches and tribes of his family. And I want to make one note. Sometimes when we read these Old Testament passages, we're left with some confusion because people will say, well, look, these patriarchs, they had concubines, they had multiple wives, some of the kings. I just want to make this one distinction. People who get it twisted, let's say, sorry, I know that tripod is right in between me and you. People who get it twisted in terms of how they're going to try to interpret those Bible passages, say some branches of Christian, historically Christian tradition, at least in a general sense, like Mormonism, might look back and use those as interpretation to justify polygamy and all those kind of things. One important biblical principle that I just make note of is just because it's mentioned, I've said this a lot, there's a difference between description and prescription. I can describe something. The Bible often describes historic events without prescribing them as godly activity. You understand? So when we see that in Abraham's life, later, biblical law is going to rather explicitly condemn that kind of behavior. And then but you might say, well, Abraham lived prior to that law, to Levitical law and the clarity of the law. Okay, that's one way to think about it. However, even after the law comes, you see Israel's kings often living in disobedience, even King David living in disobedience. But that's the point, is that's disobedient behavior that's not consistent. However, this is an important point too, that doesn't mean that those kings weren't still used by God, or that David wasn't still used by God, or that Abraham wasn't still used by God. And this specifically is well prior to those laws being established. Up to this point, they have the 10 Commandments, which elevates them out. And even right in the 10 Commandments contain the seed for all of the rest of the law. So he's still not doing things 100% accurately here. So, which is just significant to note when you see that. things like that, especially in the Old Testament, don't assume that that's exactly what he was supposed to be doing. You understand what I'm saying? That's all. Always remember that. I think that's one of the key biblical principles, is the distinction between description and prescription. Was it God's will? Was it God's perfect will that Judas, after the betrayal, went and committed suicide? Was that God's perfect will? I don't think so, but that's definitely what occurred. That was a description of his behavior, but that's not to say if you betray the Lord, there is no redemption for you, because that runs counterintuitive to major themes of the Bible. And this is another one of those. Abraham's behavior in chapter 25, 1 through 18, it's like God is still dealing with humanity in its relative infancy. This isn't the best practice, but we do see that it took place. Okay, so we're going to pick up at Genesis 25:19 and begin from there. And I think it would be helpful if someone were willing to read Genesis 25:19 through 28 would probably be good. Genesis 25, verse 19 through 28. Would someone care to read that? Any volunteer? Yes, ma'am. Susan, please. Genesis 25:19 to 28.
This is the account of the family of Isaac, the son of Abraham. When Isaac was 40 years old, he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Armenian from Adam Aram, and the sister of Laban the Aramite.
And remember, here's another important Bible principle, especially when the pastor asks you to read during Advent. Just roll right through it. Just read it and roll right through it. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Sometimes I'm not entirely certain how to say a biblical name, and I just say it like I know it. Just roll right through it. I've learned to do the same thing when I'm quoting Greek and Hebrew. I'm not, my original languages aren't that great. I'm just going to read right through it.
Okay, Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was unable to have children. The Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant with twins. The two children struggled with each other in her womb, so she went to ask the Lord about it. Why is this happening to me? She asked. And the Lord told her, the sons in your womb will become two nations. From the very beginning, the two nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. And when the time came to give birth, Rebekah discovered that she did indeed have twins. The first one was very red at birth and covered with thick hair like a fur coat. So they named him Esau. Then the other twin was born with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So they named him Jacob. That's right there. Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born.
Let's see. Did you make it? Did you read 27 and 28? Oh, read 27 and 28. Don't worry about the asterisks.
As the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter. He was an outdoorsman, but Jacob had a quiet temperament, preferring to stay at home. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game Esau brought home. But Rebekah loved Jacob. One day, when Jacob was cooking.
That's good right there, Susan. That's excellent. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about this. We touched on it last week, only a little bit, but let's talk about this from the lesson outline, and then however else the Lord leads. So beginning right there, conflict sets the stage for the story of Isaac. So Jacob is born grasping the heel of his brother Esau. So is named Jacob, which in the original language literally means he cheats. And there is, like your New Living Translation Bible give a little asterisk, a little insight. So there is in a lot of these, especially when you're in Genesis, it's not always perfectly clear exactly, maybe so some potential variation on it, especially because in the Old Testament, a lot of the words are non-literal and a lot of the phraseology is non-literal. Like, what's a good example of a phrase we use where let's say we call somebody a bonehead. So what are we saying? We're saying, or an airhead, that's even better, because bonehead, you do have some bone up here. So that's almost literal. An airhead, well, no one literally has air in their head, right? So but if you stop and pay attention, just pay attention today as you go about your day-to-day business, and notice anytime you use a phrase that you take sort of literally, you know what it means, but it's non-literal. Those of us who speak more than one language know that it can be very confusing from one language to the next. And also learning a second language will open up your mind to how non-literal your language is. Like Haitian Creole couldn't be less literal. There's all kinds of, I mean, I could smart off to Ed sometimes with one word, like, or two or three, just a few words. And the same thing is true in English. There are times where, what you're saying is, so if you go to translate, like if I call somebody an airhead and you're going to translate that, say, into, I don't know, Arabic, what are you going to do? Are you going to literally write airhead? Well, what if that has no meaning in their cultural context? And maybe it means, they'd be like, what? So you'd have to rephrase it, and then you'd have to figure out the intent of the writer. Or is he trying to insult them? Was it supposed to be funny? Was it more like, oh, she's just a little ditzy? What does that even mean? Ditzy? What is that word? What does that even mean? That's not a literal word. And so the same thing happens in the Old Testament a lot. And with his name, there's a little bit of that going on. So Jacob means heel grabber or usurper. But if you literally translated that, and then heel grabber was born, you'd be like, what? What does that mean? And so anyway, it's important. Here we go. Division between the brothers is clear from birth. God speaks to Rebekah, telling her, they're all the time fighting in your belly because they're going to be the fathers of two nations that are going to have problems with each other. And so the division between the brothers is clear even from birth. And Isaac, and let's finish that. So it can mean he cheats, heel grabber. So in the ancient world, kind of like bonehead or airhead, if somebody was a cheater, you might be like, hey, heel grabber, which wouldn't mean a thing if you didn't know where the phrase came from. It wouldn't mean anything. I can think of a bunch of phrases in Haitian Creole that are like that. You wouldn't have the first clue if I said them literally. You'd be like, what on earth? Spanish, I'm sure, has a ton of that in it too. It must. And English definitely does. So all languages do. So it's also, we do well to be as kind as we can to Bible translators because they try to deal with that stuff. And that's why some people, myself included, prefer some of the more literal translations like the King James or the NASB, where they leave some of that in and then they'll put a footnote to help you understand what was going on, which is very helpful. So it means he cheats. Yeah, go ahead.
That way of communication is throughout the world. It varies. When I remember this one scene in this John Wayne movie, he was talking about he was growing up with the Apaches, and this woman was asking him questions about basically describing his wife that he had, and talking about her hair, and he was using the phraseology of the Apaches, and that it was like you were describing. You were saying airhead. It was like, because it was a verbal language, it wasn't written in very, as opposed to English, was very concise. And in many ways, when you take like the literal thing, you can send it down 500, 1,000 years,
right,
and still understand it if you understand talking. As opposed to this verbal language that had phraseologies that were pertinent for the time, but evolved and changed as the culture. So 500 years from now, airhead may not have the same kind of
it might mean something completely different or be completely nonsensical. Exactly.
Salty, stupid stuff. I mean, it's like, what does that mean?
Right.
And they just make up words and add
Right.
their meaning to it.
Yeah, we had a situation I was monitoring our daughter's social media, and one of the comments had like the angry kind of emoticon with the tear. And so I was like, what the heck's this about? And she's like, what do you mean, Mom? It's like in Creole, when you say not roulette, you're like, I'm hot, I'm on fire. And I'm like, no, that's, to me, I'm looking at it like, that's an angry.
Like somebody's mad.
That means like someone's mad at you. She's like, no, it means like you're hot. And I'm like, okay.
And that Christina and I, Christina is always working on her Creole language skills to get them up and up, and I'm always trying to sharpen mine because I always need to do better. And there's an app that came out recently that a lot of the missionary community were very excited about, because it's hard to find a good app for your phone for learning Creole. And so Duolingo came out with one, and like the very first phrase, right? We could have a whole discussion about the very first phrase was this saying you say to people. Sometimes you'll see my kids wearing a shirt that says sac passe. Sac passe. Well, that's a very street way of saying hello or how are you, but it's more like literally saying what's up, or right, like that, or it's almost like saying sup. Like it's not even like I would never say sac passe to my grandmother. Like that's not okay. And then the appropriate response is not boule. Now, not boule literally means nous ap boule. It literally means we are burning. That's what it literally means. We are burning. Okay. So, but in this app, right? And in this app, it said it's how are you, sac passe, which is not what it is. And then it says the appropriate response, which is if somebody says to you sac passe, the appropriate response is not boule, but it literally means we are burning. And in the app, it said, I'm good. And I said, that's not what it means. And then she's like, yeah, but on the street, right, in practical usage, yeah, it does intimate that. But if you're a brand new Creole speaker and you think not boule means I'm good, you might go trying to use those words in other sentences and you're going to be dead wrong. So Christina and I had this, I'm like, no, they need to say in that app what that really means. She's like, yeah, and she's right. I think I'm right and she's right. She's right, because if you, but on the street, yeah, it means I'm good. But if I go trying to mess around and I want to tell somebody the food is good and I'm like, oh man, this manger is boule, like they'll be like, what? Like it doesn't make any sense. So anyway, the point is, and I love talking about language, it is useful to think in these ways when it comes to reading the Bible, because a lot of what's in the Bible is non-literal in its original language. So it's useful to remember that. And then that's the reason why we couldn't be more blessed. In Haitian Creole, there aren't very many translations of the Bible. There's the Haitian Creole version that I use. I know of a couple newer translations, but to my knowledge, there isn't even but one translation of the Old Testament. And now there's maybe a few translations of the New Testament. And like in Spanish, are there a lot? In Spanish, there's the La Biblia, La Saint Biblia or whatever this. Yeah. 3 or 4. In English, right? It's much more traditional, right? Yeah. But in English, there are 300 or 400 translations, and there's like 200 that are main translations, and then there's probably maybe 30 to 50 that are like solid. Like you could use any one of those. Maybe I'd say there's 10 or 15 I'd recommend, but there's probably 30 to 50 that you could say, oh yeah, that translation committee, it was legit. So we're super blessed because, yeah, like English translations. Yeah.
Okay, so American.
But there's like hundreds. Yeah. The NASB?
Yeah.
More literal. That would be more literal. Literal, but modern. So the translation, yeah. Yeah, the NASB is even more literal than King James in most instances. Yeah, the MEV is the modern English version. Yeah. It's less common. It's not a common translation, but it's not in a lot of study Bibles, but I like it, and he liked it for me.
You know, not to belabor this, but
Yeah.
last night I had a conversation.
We're already well into belaboring it, so go ahead. Yeah.
My son, he's reading the Bible through,
Yeah.
and he said, why did God say, when he said God saw that the light was good?
Right.
He said, well, it was God, he knew it was good. I said, I think that meant he was pleased.
That's right.
But
100%.
He said, oh, that makes sense.
Yep.
But the translation
Yes.
is.
Exactly. And that's almost right. And when you talk about what God said, in a sense, yeah, like God is already, any means of communication God chooses to use with us, whether it's everything from Abraham or Moses hearing audible voices to the impressions and leadings we get now, or to reading from the Bible, it's all still God very much sort of, condescending to us in such a way, and, not in the, in the most literal sense of the word condescension. He's stooping down to communicate with us like a man to his 3-year-old child. So yeah, I saw it and it was good, God says. It's like, I'm pleased. I agree with that 100%. Yeah. Right. Oh yeah. Right.
The way that I could start understanding the King James in English.
Yeah.
That Asian Shakespeare language.
Oh yeah.
With this Bible.
Really with it, yeah.
Because it explains like to the children, and I
Yeah.
in Sunday school when I was because it goes like the current language.
That's right.
People understand those.
That's a good translation. New Century Version is one of the probably 15 or 16. When I say there's probably 15 or 16, I would recommend people. That's on that list. It's a good it's, you're always going to get criticisms of Bible translations no matter what, but that's definitely one of the reliable ones. Okay, so he's the heel grabber. He's the usurper from an actual event. So the word Jacob, his name has a non-literal meaning, but it has a concrete source or history. So division between the brothers is clear from birth, and Isaac favors Esau while Rebekah favors Jacob. Who knew that something like that could ever happen, where the father favors one of the children and the mother favors the other? It happens, right? It happens. Really? Yeah. That's terrible. Yeah. Right. Oh wow. Oh wow. So here, oh go ahead. Huh. Are they very different in their personalities? Yeah. Right. Oh wow.
The short one day when we go, she always struggled with her little box, and she's standing beside her sister. Because she's so short and
That's funny. That's funny. Okay, so let's see. We read through that portion. We actually discussed a little bit about that last week. Okay, so that's useful to know. There, I did find some potentially valuable commentary on this. We'll leave it alone. Let's move down to him selling the birthright and focus on that for the next 27 minutes. We'll finish the Bible study looking entirely at and whatever comes out of it, Esau selling his birthright. So we can see that it's important to look at that section before we look at this section. We can see first that God had said the older would serve the younger. And that's present in the previous section. The God had told Rebekah, the older will serve the younger. God had told Rebekah that that they were at war with each other even in the womb, because they were going to be at war with each other in life, even as they were fathers of tribes. So that's important to note. Then you can see that even in their birth, which is kind of it's a strange thing to think of in will and intention, even among infants, but I think maybe that's possible here. Also, it's one of those cases where you could look at something after the fact and say, oh, you remember that? He was even grabbing his heel on the way out. So it's not necessarily that the description is that the infants had this will about them. It's just, as you look back, you might say, oh, see that? They've had that rivalry even as they were coming out of the womb. So that there's that. And that's we find that kind of an idea often in the Bible too. We see that in the New Testament, sometimes New Testament writers say Jesus fulfilled something, but it wasn't a prophecy. It's like, oh, look, Jesus' life fits that. That's a part of what that Old Testament passage meant. That's a type and a foretype. Okay, so let's take a look at, would someone else like to read Genesis 25:29 through 34? And then we'll emphasize and talk about this a bit. All right, go right ahead.
Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he is also called Edom. Jacob replied, "First tell me your birthright." "Look, I am about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright.
Yeah, absolutely. Or had contempt for it even. So this is interesting. Listen to, you can take a look. It's up on the screen. This is some commentary on this section right here, 29 through 34, from James Vernon McGee that I found very helpful. And I think there's a little bit we can talk about in it before we look at some of these other things. So here's what he writes, starting right here. Let's stop and look for a minute at the value of the birthright and what it means. It means that the one who had it was head of the house. That's what the birthright was about. That so whoever in that ancient culture, whoever was handed the birthright, and we'll see it's like the patriarch, he puts his hand to anoint in a sense to pass on the birthright. So whoever was going to receive the birthright, he's going to be the head of the house in the broadest sense, like the head of the tribe, the head of the family, the clan. It also means that the one who had it was the priest of the family. And that's really interesting. I find it very valuable that McGee emphasized this. In this particular family, it means that the one who had it would be the one who would be in line that would lead to Christ. So this is fascinating. So the one who is going to have the birthright. Remember how did Israel often refer to God? They considered his name too holy to say, Yahweh, Yod-He, Vav-He, Yahweh. They considered it too holy to say. So to this very day, many Orthodox Jews will refer to God as Hashem, which means, you know what it means? It means the name. So they're literally calling God the name because they're saying, don't say his name, it's too holy. In ancient texts, you find that Yahweh was often only done as a tetragrammaton. So it was not, they wouldn't put the vowels in. So they just wanted you to know that's what they were saying. It was too holy to say. Okay, so they often refer to him as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But had the birthright passed to Esau, it would be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Esau. So descending from Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel, descending from Jacob is Jesus, Yeshua. So this is really important. Whoever was going to receive the birthright from that would have started with Abraham, going to Isaac, who remember Abraham was willing to sacrifice. Now, whoever receives the birthright from Isaac, from him is going to be the straight line to the Messiah. In this, particular family, the one that had it would be the one in the line that would lead to Christ. And McGee asked this question, do you think Esau had valued it at all? So before I read the rest of this commentary, what do you think? He's going to answer it a little bit, but what do you think? I mean, what do you think of when certainly for most of us, this isn't the first time we've heard the story of Jacob and Esau. And every time I've ever heard it, it sounded like or read it, it always struck me as almost I never really looked at it with as much precision as I have in this Bible study to try to unpack it. Because every time I've heard it, it sounded almost made up. Like, this can't be good biblical history, because who on earth would sell their birthright for some porridge? And so absolutely. He could have got some other food. Like he's the son of a patriarch. He likes it. So surely that's it. But think about it. I mean, I like a lot of things. Like, for the record, if anybody wants it, Yogi left a lemon meringue pie up there. So speaking of food that's worth breaking your diet for, if you want one of those, it came from Publix. They're good. If you want that lemon meringue pie, you can take it, because we don't think it'll keep well for Sunday. But anyway, I really like, let's say lobster. I'm a big fan of the lobster. Not as big as my wife, but I like lobster. But you could bring me a 26-pound lobster, and it doesn't mean that I'm good. If I'm in line for some massive inheritance, and you're like, but I'll give you the lobster, but I have an inheritance worth, say, millions, I'd be like, not a chance. That's not happening. Okay, so you say, but the text says he was out in the field. He was super hungry. Okay, but like Christina said, he can go get some other food.
About how old were they at this age? I mean, were they adults?
That's right. Jacob really wanted it.
Yes.
So they would have been adult age for sure. I'm not positive if the
There wasn't,
text.
like, Hansel coming in on one?
No, he's a man. He's out hunting wild game. So, and I think somewhere it actually said how old they were. I want to say 40, but that may not be accurate. No, that's how old it was when Isaac married Rebekah. So, but they're certainly grown. Okay, so go ahead, Susan.
Okay, I just want to ask this, and I don't know how to do it.
Yeah,
Apparently, Isaac was always supposed to get it.
yeah, always.
So there was really actually, it wasn't an accident, it wasn't a whatever.
Yeah, no,
They were the Lord preordained.
absolutely. And right, Abraham, so Isaac for sure, and Jacob too, was supposed to get it. In fact, we're going to get to that because that's an important point to make too. Because what you see here is, well, we can talk about it right now. Here is a good example of not waiting for God's timing. In fact, not waiting for God's timing. Here, take a look at. Strangely enough, it's how God worked, right? And I think the biblical principle there is sometimes you might hear me say occasionally, I don't say it a lot because it confuses people unless I explain it. God will even use your sin to accomplish his will. And this is what I'm talking about. Sometimes, okay, so he knows how messed up we can be. And he tells us that this is going to come to pass in your life. And then you do something that a preacher I know in North Carolina said it best. He said, sometimes people try to do God's will the world's way. And that's what's happening right here. Okay, so Jacob has already been told that God told his mother Rebekah, said, you have these two twins in your womb. They're going to fight. They're fighting in your womb. They're going to fight as adults, but the younger will serve the older will serve the younger. So no doubt Rebekah, who just loved and doted on her baby boy Jacob, no doubt she had told him, don't you worry about that Esau. God told me that he's going to serve you. No, she did. There's no doubt. In fact, yeah, anyway, I'll leave that. But anyway, when I was in Israel, I heard a lot of sayings from Jewish people about Jewish moms and their sons that were kind of interesting, how much they'd love and dote on their sons. And anyway, if that's true, it must go all the way back to here. So he knows already, that God has foreordained that his older brother, who's only older than him briefly, is going to serve him. But instead of saying, in God's time, that will occur, he's tricking him with a bowl of porridge to give him the birthright. Like, this family, there has got to be no greater set of examples that God will redeem your sin, that God will use you no matter how messed up you are. Right in the origin in Genesis, we see 100% that's real. So yeah, for sure. And Isaac was always going to happen, but Abraham doubted. And that's why Esau was born. And then Sarah doubted and laughed at the angel. And that's why she brought her servant and says, here, get her pregnant. She's young. I'm an old woman. It's never going to happen. But time and again, this is the story of Israel. And it's the story of us, if we're honest. Time and again, we don't listen to the word of God. We don't listen to the voice of God. We rebel. We don't wait in God's time. We get nervous, worried. We try to do God's will the world's way. And sometimes it causes a lot of problems in our life. And sometimes God must laugh and say, okay, I'm going to redeem even your ridiculousness. And I'm still going to bring it to pass because I will that it be done, not because you did the right thing. So, yeah, it's a good question. Okay. So here's the question that James Vernon McGee asks that I think is the right question. Maybe this helps unpack why Esau would be so careless with the birthright. Do you think that Esau had valued it at all? Well, listen to what he says. Jacob knew that he didn't. Jacob knew that he didn't. So in their upbringing, Jacob must have been fully aware that his brother didn't really care about the birthright. He attached no importance to it, McGee writes. And James Vernon McGee, if you're unfamiliar with him, he's deceased now in heaven. He was a country guy with a brilliant country logic that I always appreciated. And he was like the preacher of what do you call it? Not practical sense, common sense. He was like the preacher of common sense. He attached no importance to it, and he didn't want to be priest of the family. So there you go. I think that answers the question best. Why on earth would Esau sell his birthright for a bowl of porridge? No matter how good, you're not getting me to do that. But he did, because maybe James Vernon McGee is right. I think that must be right. He didn't want it at all. And I always, when I read this text, that just never crossed my mind. It always was like, man, how did that guy get tricked with a bowl of porridge? Like, how is that even possible? And it made me question whether this could be real biblical history or just some story. But that's it exactly. He didn't care about it. In fact, that's the last thing McGee says he wanted to be. And I think that must be right on point. In our day, sometimes when a Christian is asked to do something for the cause of Christ, he replies, "Oh, I'm not a preacher. I can't do that." And it's like, okay, yeah, that's it exactly, isn't it? God calls you to do something, and it's like, I don't want to be the head of this family. Esau loved to be out in the woods hunting. He was a wild man, it says, with red hair covering his whole body as if it was a coat. So you can imagine the type, no doubt, probably kind of jacked, muscular, covered in hair. You know, he's a wild man. It's like he's from the woods in Oregon, like some of my family. They're kind of wild people. They don't even want to give the impression that they're interested in spiritual things. You know the type. It's like, hey, I'll donate a few dollars. I'll pray once in a while, but don't ask me to do anything real spiritual, because I don't want nothing to do with that. So when I think of it that way, I think McGee's on point. It's easier for me to imagine how this could happen, because Esau is the person who doesn't want to be the priest of his family. That was Esau. He didn't want to give that impression. If anyone would have called him deacon or preacher, it would have insulted him. He didn't want the birthright. He didn't care about being in the line that led to Christ, which is just amazing. Like, that is a big statement. He didn't care about being in the line that led to Christ. No one could have cared less about being in that line. Now McGee is taking some liberty. I don't know if that's 100% true, but it does seem to be on point. Jacob sees this. Jacob already knows his brother, because you know your brother. Jacob sees it. He knows his brother doesn't care. He sees, here's my opportunity to make sure to help God out in his plan. Because Mama already told me. Mama said, he's like Bobby Boucher in the A Waterboy movie. You ever seen that? And the guy, this country guy, and he loves his mama, and he goes to college, and he tells the college professor, he says, Mama said alligators is angry because they got all them teeth, but they got no toothbrush. And the professor goes on to explain to him that's not true. And he busts Bobby Boucher's bubble because he thinks everything his mama said is right. Well, I'm acting a little bit like James Vernon McGee. I'm reading into it a little bit. I think that Jacob was a spoiled mama's boy who believed everything his mom said. And God had told her that he's going to serve you. So what does he do? He's going to help him out a little bit. He already knows that his brother couldn't care less about the birthright. So he seizes his opportunity. Jacob sees him. He knows he doesn't care. And he says to him, I'll tell you what I'll do. If you'll give me your birthright, I'll give you a bowl of stew. That seems like the most absurd statement in all of the Bible. Esau was very happy with the bargain, which is the second most absurd statement in all of the Bible. He said, I'll be very happy to do it. There's the third most absurd statement in all of the Bible. What profit is the birthright to me? And there's number 4. What do I care about the birthright? Number 5. Number 6, most ridiculous statement in the Bible. I'd rather have a bowl of stew. In fact, after this Bible study, if somebody asks me something absurd, I'm going to say, I'd rather have a bowl of stew. Yes.
On the other hand, it says that Jacob came out grasping Esau's stew.
Right.
So therefore, he was grasping for the
Oh, the birthright. Yeah, 100%. 100%. That's the direct. Yes, that's the irony of it. So from the start, he's been trying to get his birthright. And the writer of this text, who probably, I think the whole Pentateuch, the Jews always attributed it to Moses. I'm 99.9% sure. Look that up for me. I don't want to misstate that. I'm pretty sure. Who wrote the Pentateuch? I'm pretty sure the Jews always attribute it to Moses, but for some reason I've got a little screw loose here. I'm not positive. And so anyway, the writer of the text, looking back, does it say Moses? Looking back at all of biblical history, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible? I'm almost certain it's always been attributed to Moses, but for some reason I'm having a little airheaded moment, and I want to make sure that I'm right. I don't like passing on that kind of. Oh yeah. Okay. The Pentateuch, pent, like pentagram, pent means 5. The first 5 books of the Bible are called the Pentateuch. That's what the Jews always referred to them as. And Moses has always been given credit for having written all 5. But he's writing oral tradition, which before you think that's a crazy thing, like that's a good little sub note to that. When you think, oh well, how could Moses accurately write the Pentateuch when it was all oral tradition? Well, you got to stop and put yourself in a different cultural context. We are I value books above everything but my wife and family. I mean, books, we're a written down culture. I know Haiti is not exactly a non-written culture, but it's certainly not you don't go find in a lot of libraries, right? And I know Haitian people who I met once, 7 years ago. And if I run into them today, oh, Pastor Chris, from 100 feet away, they'll recognize me, know my name, remember my kids' names. So if you think about a language which is less written, a culture which has less writing, that oral tradition memory is next level. You guys would agree with that, I'm sure, right? Yeah, it's like, so now imagine an ancient culture before there even was a printing press. The human mind, like since these cell phones came around, I can only tell you my phone number. That's it. I don't even always. Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, your grandparents and stuff, they can tell you stories that their grandparents told them, and they were like descriptive stories. They could tell you the streets and the types of houses,
right?
And they could tell you.
And also remember, everybody's doing that in this society. So there's a collaborative effort in the oral tradition. So what Moses writes it's accurate. Okay. So anyway, looking back, writing over that, that's what he sees. The elder shall serve the younger. He's going to go ahead and help him out. The birthright is coming to Jacob. Here it is. Let us remember, right here, highlighted in green. Let us remember that Jacob also was wrong in what he did. So that's an important thing. It's not like he did the right thing. Don't ever do God's will the world's way. God had promised the elder shall serve the younger. And he knew it because his mama said it. The birthright is coming to Jacob in God's own time, but Jacob can't wait. So he reaches out to take that which God has promised him. It's just like Maisie just said, being born, he's reaching out to grab his heel. Now, as adult men, he's reaching out to grab that heel one more time, just to make sure that it happens. So he reaches out to take that which God has promised him. He takes it in a clever, tricky fashion. He should have waited for God to give it to him. Right? He would have had the greater blessing. Wait for God to give it to you. This man operated on the principle that he would do what he could for himself. He thought that as long as he could help himself, there was no reason to look to God to perform it. I think that is also a hugely important principle found in this scripture.
But don't you see how each generation, that makes sense of that generation, because they did not have the interaction with God like his mother had.
Oh, right.
He denied that she was going to ever get pregnant.
Right.
And they got to war and did the impossible.
Right.
And she became, in a sense, a true believer.
Oh, yeah. Right.
You see what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And Abraham is a true believer.
Yep.
Because of his interaction. But Isaiah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Isaac and yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So he tricked his brother.
Right.
You see what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah. I think that it could be said that people, no doubt because of our sinful condition, because of the, what you call the post-Edenic epoch, because of we're out of Eden, everything since Eden, in a fallen condition, in a less than perfect state that the Bible says we're going to be restored to after the return of Christ in that millennial reign and afterwards, people seem to have super long memories on things that are bad and have amnesia on things that are good. Right. I mean, think about it. We know people, we are the people we know. I mean, we have long memories. When I pastored churches in the rural South in Southern Virginia, I was just baffled at generational memory when it came to bad things. I'm like, I can't believe like the Hatfields and the McCoys among some of these people. And the relative amnesia of when God does something good. It's like you people just had a financial miracle not more than a decade ago, and now you're talking about, oh, we're not going to make it another month. It's like, what are you talking about? Or let's say you see that repeated, starting with the patriarchs, going all the way through the post-exilic period when they were exiled after they came out of Egypt, right? I mean, you're talking about a people that if we take that biblical record seriously, which there happens to be some incredible archaeological evidence to take it seriously, that God literally parted the Red Sea. Okay. Then you're talking less than a generation later, they're like, we should go back to Egypt. At least we had plenty of food to eat. It's like, what are you talking about? I think it's something that believers have to be at war with. Constant tendency to forget the miraculous nature of one's relationship with God. I've seen God do straight up miracles. So it's like, when I get anxious, when I get nervous about it, it's like, no, I can't do that. You remember the Red Sea, not for a bowl of stew.
And following that logic,
Yeah.
how the Catholic religion developed to where you could buy your sins.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, I would say there's a practical connection.
Yeah.
Sure. Trying to do God's things the world's way, right? Because you're like, okay, the biblical pattern is grace. God's going to forgive you. And then, the world's way, the medieval church starts to say, oh, well, hey, I mean, Jesus said we have the keys to the kingdom. So why don't we lock up some of it and charge for entrance like Disney World? Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's exactly what happened.
But Jacob took his own hand. Did God punish him for that?
It's a good question. I think we're almost done with this study. Let's see. Let's look next week. We'll look at chapter 26. We'll finish this study. 26 chapter 1 talks about God's promise to Isaac. I can't think of an example other than we will see that Jacob has to humble himself in front of his brother later because he knows his brother is the greater warrior. And he gives him a big gift of animals. I think that's in 26 or 27. And he does it, and he tries to force his brother to accept the gift because culturally, him accepting that gift publicly means they're okay. So other than his need for humility, we'll see in the next couple chapters. That's entirely possible.
Why does he say here, look, I'm about to die?
Where at?
I know.
Oh, yeah. He's just being dramatic. Yeah. He's so hungry. He's like, I'm done. And things like this too. I find these. Yeah, I'm famished. Yeah. Right, exactly. And you hear people say that. You hear American kids say, I'm starving. When my kids say that, I'll just give them a stern look. Like, people that actually starve. Don't say that. And that's all it is. So yeah. And again, okay, we'll close this out. Another footnote of Bible interpretation that's really useful to remember. That's among the ways we know the Bible is true, because it contains real accounts. These are the patriarchs, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? This big, and Jacob is tricking his brother, and then Esau, who would have been an important man, no doubt. He had a tribe of his own. he's dying. He's going to die because he's so hungry. He's the son of a patriarch. They had herds and cattle. There was more than enough food. He probably could order somebody to make him food. Don't forget that he was out in the woods hunting, and he's apparently like a great woodsman, a great person of the field. Yeah. So again, it's just like in the New Testament when we see in John's gospel, this is the other way this principle works. In John's gospel, we see John refer to himself several times as the disciple whom Jesus loved best. And we say, oh, way to work your ego into your gospel. Way to go. And then it helps us to know that it's true because it's not like a wooden thing. We see the human character inside of the Bible. Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming. Yes, ma'am. Go right ahead. I am